Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about GDP, which is commonly known as Gross Domestic Product. So, what is GDP? We might have heard about GDP a lot of times. Well, it's by definition, it is the sum of the values of all the final goods and services in a country. Well, let's get to the detail. GDP is the sum of money value of all final goods and services produced in a domestic economy and sold in organized markets. So here are like three components. Let's say those three components are one is goods and services, another one is a domestic economy, and another one is organized market. So well, we need to have the goods and services produced within the domestic economy or the economy of a country inside the country, and they has to be sold in the organized markets where the demand and supply works, or where a lot of commodities are bought and sold, and the transactions are done so that it will be reflected in the taxation. Now, the formula for GDP is consumption plus government spending plus investment plus export minus import. Consumption actually denotes to the goods bought by the people for their regular uses, for their everyday uses. That's what can read in the consumption, like eating outside in a restaurant, or buying stuff from the supermarket. That all comes in consumption. Government spending is the money spent by the government, which can be the taxpayers' dollars, or it can be the borrowed amount through the exchange of bonds, or from lending from the foreign government or the local people. And I stands for investment. Investment is something that for which the money is invested in order to gain something, in order to produce something. Well, here I want to say something about consumption and investment. Well, consumptions and investments are intertwined. They might be confusing because they might sound same, but they are not. They are not. We know that they are the same side of. Two sides of the same coin, but they are different. Now, the next factor is export. If a country exports something to other countries, then it is counted as a positive GDP, or increase in GDP. And if the other country imports something from other countries, it is a negative GDP. Now, there are two types of GDP that can be measured. One is the real GDP, and another one is nominal. Nominal GDP takes the GDP into account, or compares different GDP at the current prices. Like if something is produced in 2018 or 2019, nominal GDP indicates those goods and services produced in that year as per the value of 2020, at which we're right now. But unlike nominal GDP, real GDP is measured in their respective years. So all the values of goods and services produced in a country is valued in the same year. So because there's like inflation or deflation that can really change the prices, so the nominal GDP doesn't really reflect the actual true value. Well, recession, as per the meaning of recession, it's defined as the negative growth of the GDP for two or more consecutive quarters. Like in a year, there are four quarters. So if more than two quarters have the negative growth, then it is called recession. So what gets counted on GDP? In GDP, all the goods and services that are produced in the market and sold, and the data gets to the government, then it's counted on the GDP. If the data doesn't get to the government, it doesn't get counted. So just for example, comparing the GDP internationally, there are like a lot of companies from the US that manufactures in China. So the companies are from the United States. All the technology, all the ideas, innovation that comes from United States, but they are produced in China. Hence, they are produced in Chinese soil. All those goods and services are counted in the economy or GDP of China. So what doesn't gets counted in GDP? That's a long list. So the sale of items from previous years. So the item is from previous years and sold in this year. The item from 2019 sold in 2020 doesn't get counted in 2020. And resale value of assets. Goods and commodities are resold again and again through online or through garage sale or advertisement, and those resale value of those assets are not counted in the GDP because they have already been counted previously. So if I bought a second-hand car, then it doesn't get counted in the GDP because those car was bought by someone else in the first place in some year previously, which has already been counted. Now here's an example. It says that Dell Computers buy, and a lot of computer companies buys microprocessor chips from Intel, but it doesn't want the chips for itself. It's for the computer it makes that's going to be sold to the consumers. So the purchase of chips from the Intel by Dell doesn't get counted in the GDPs. Illegal activities are not counted in GDP because they are illegal, because they are prohibited by the law, so they cannot be counted. Garage sales, same like before. Housework, do-it-yourself repairs or works that can be done at home. Even if you get some raw material and produce some finished goods at home, it doesn't really get counted in the GDP because they are not sold or in the organized markets. The machineries that the factory produces to produce the final goods, they are not counted in the GDP. Limitation of GDP. Well, GDP is not the measurement of nation's well-being. GDP is something else. So what are the limitations of GDP? The first one is only market activities included in GDP. So non-market activities or illegal activities are not counted in the GDP, though they involve the money transactions in itself. So here's the one important thing that needs an attention. That's while comparing the GDP in rich and poor countries. While we count the GDP in poor countries, a lot of information, a lot of businesses are not registered. They don't pay tax, and everything happens in cash. So they are out of the government side and does not get counted in the GDP. And in the rich countries, those every business transactions legally are counted in the GDP. So while comparing the GDP of rich countries and poor countries, it seems that the rich countries are much more richer than the poor countries. The poor countries are so poor that people are like earning just $1 a day, but that's not the case because a lot of businesses are done outside the organized markets. Because in poor countries, people do, for example, in agriculture, they do farming, they grow vegetables, they take to the market, sell it, they get money, and they fulfill the need of other people, and that's not counted in the GDP. But there is a transaction, there is an earning. So the GDP values, while comparing rich and poor countries, could be misleading. So GDP places no value in leisure. What does that mean? It means that if a country economy is growing, then people's lifestyle will be easier, their living standards will grow, and hence they will get more leisure time. It means that people's well-being is growing, but it doesn't get reflected in the GDP. So bad as well as good get counted in GDP. So here bad means some disasters that happens in a country. When if there's a disaster, let's say an earthquake, a pandemic, then government um, spending source too high, and hence the government spending is counted in GDP. The country's GDP will look much more nicer, where in fact in reality it's not. And that fact should be looked into the debt, government accumulated debt or household debt of 30 years. Only after that, putting them together, we can get a clearer picture. So, and there's another factor, it's war. If a country is war, then it has to convert its factory to produce the weapons for war. Let's say for chemicals producing factories will be converted to the factories that produces explosives and other stuff, and the factories that produces car will be producing tanks and so forth. The country at war cannot be well better than other countries, but the GDP will seem too high. Ecological costs, the environmental damages or the ecological cost we call it, are not counted in the GDP. So if in China a lot of rivers are being polluted, a lot of environment is being polluted, trees are being cut down. So basically, if you look at bigger picture, it's bad, it's going to worse. But the factories in China are producing a lot of stuff that indicates that the GDP is going high, but it's not reflective of the real situation there. Thank you.